мною принято решение о проведении специальной военной операции.
Putin called this a special military operation, but it's clear this is a full-scale invasion.
The launch of Russia's full-scale invasion against Ukraine on 24th of February 2022 is the biggest military mobilization in Europe since 1945. Attacks by Russian forces were reported in major cities across Ukraine, including Berdyansk, Chernihiv, Kharkiv, Odessa, Sumy, and the capital, Kyiv. The Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights verified 9,614 deaths of civilians in Ukraine during the war as of September 2023. The war resulted in a humanitarian crisis as thousands of Ukrainians were internally displaced or fled abroad. Neighboring Poland recorded as the highest number of border crossings from Ukraine at around 14.4 million as of August 2023. The Soviet Union was a large empire in northern Eurasia that existed from 1922 to 1991. It encompasses 15 Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR. In 1949, the US, Canada, and the European allies created the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is called as NATO, as a display of strength against the USSR. This Ukraine-Russian crisis started when Ukraine has been wavering between the West and Russia since 2000s. This means that Ukraine has not been able to fully join a Western alliance and has not accepted to be fully under Russian influence. Meaning of that, in the case of Russia, the reason for going into conflict with Ukraine is to protect its border and to maintain its regional influence in the east of Europe. Effect from that, Ukraine experienced a more devastating effect from the invasion than Russia and the entire Euro area, in which core consumer prices in Ukraine and the Euro area were highly correlated during the invasion. This conflict led to a global rise in prices, leading to a rise in global inflation. From that, we can see how it is important to understand and identify how the invasion affected global business activities and prices and the implication for the future. It is because full economic consequences of Russian invasion of Ukraine may not be fully known until the crisis ends. However, an early economic data shows some significant movement in global economic data as a result of Russian invasion of Ukraine. Purchasing Managers Index is an indicator of economic health for manufacturing and service sectors, in which it shows that the increase in the Global Purchasing Managers Index and an increase in the world price of food and food ingredients. Not only that, the index of global stock markets plunged on the day of invasion. So, from this crisis, we would like to analyze and identify a further discussion about this issue, especially on how crisis of Russia war against Ukraine will be affect the global economic. As we all know, Russia is the main producer of energy. However, Russia also produces fertilizers, agricultural products such as wheat, sunflower oil, and corn. And for the Ukraine, the main exports are agricultural products such as wheat, soybeans, and barley.
Why Ukraine and Russia are important countries in the world? Generally, Russia and Ukraine are key suppliers to many countries that are highly dependent on imported foodstuff and fertilizers. As mentioned just now, Ukraine is the most important producer of agricultural commodities in the world, while Russia is a leading producer and exporter of energy and fertilizers. This is the reason why the war in Ukraine is resulting in growing global market tightness, lifting price for food, fertilizers, and energy to new high. Other than that, Ukraine also be important part to Russia and the rest of the world because of their economic status. It is because the Ukraine economy is a major player on the world stage because of Ukraine can offer a large consumer market, a highly educated and cost competitive workforce, and also they have abundant natural resources.
Why did Russia launch a full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022? Based on my research, they are due to relation of Ukraine and NATO, as well as economic, political, and military status of Ukraine. To begin, we go further with the relation of Ukraine and NATO. The truth from this war, the conflict between Ukraine and Russia goes back a long way, and a third party for this conflict is NATO, which the center of this conflict. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, was established in 1949 with the participation of 12 countries. The United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, and France are among those countries that are the most important countries. In fact, the organization's goal is to ensure their members' independence and security using both political and military means. However, their goals at that time were trying to prevent the Soviet Union from spreading through the other European nations. As we all know, after the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the Russian Federation and Ukraine both declared their independence from it. In fact, Ukraine is the biggest country in Europe aside from Russia, in which the entire region of Europe as well as the United States have a great deal of security interest in Ukraine. In terms of having a substantial economy, Ukraine is still having trouble adjusting to the demand of a market economy in the 21st century. In fact, if the Russians are forced to leave Ukraine or decide to leave, then it's reasonable to assume the pressure will be on the European Committee to accept Ukraine as a member state of the European Union of NATO. Western powers and others have taken numerous steps to support Ukraine and punish Russia for its 2022 offensive. The US has provided over 50 billion in aid, including advanced military assistance. Some NATO allies are also providing similar aid. It clearly shows that this current conflict has only the reason for NATO's existence. Following that, economic, political, and military status of Ukraine, in which we can see how Russia feels a threat from NATO's expansions to the east, and above all, fears that Ukraine, a country in which it can exert influence, will end up joining NATO, even it was something that has not yet happened. In this way, Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, intends to do everything in his power to keep Ukraine out of the West's influence. And fast forward to 2013, Ukraine's President Viktor Yanukovych wanted Ukraine to be loyal to Russia. At that time, Russia claims that President Gorbachev was promised by the US that NATO would not move to the east. It shows that the fact that Ukraine and Russia are two countries that border each other in Eastern Europe. Even in 2014, Russia already took over an area in southern Ukraine that called Crimea, where Russia has a naval base near the Black Sea. From that, we can see how Russia builds region because the terms and conditions to join NATO, in which to join NATO, before that country must first meet certain economic, political, and military standards. According to Prof. Williams, Ukraine remains a good effort from fulfilling this membership criteria, pointing to the problem with the country's democratic institutions because of the imperfect democracy system and anti-corruption processes. President of Russia, Vladimir Putin, has said it is now time for the NATO's wave of expansion to be reversed and for the alliance to guarantee that Ukraine never be allowed to become a member. From that, we can see since the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia has continued to harbor significant resentment against independent Ukraine because the country is still thinks of as a critical part of Mother Russia.
Moving to the next part, the war between Russia and Ukraine has had a significant potential impact on the global economy. First and foremost, the war between Russia and Ukraine has affected the global supply chain. The war has disrupted the production and trade of key commodities, as Russia is one of the world's largest exporters of energy commodities that supply natural oil and gas. Indeed, the war has major global ramifications, given Russia and Ukraine significant export roles in various commodities, affecting not only the European Union but also emerging markets and developing economies. The second potential impact of the Russian invasions of Ukraine has led to major food security concerns for millions of people, resulting in increased food prices and shortages and affecting a global food crisis. The invasion caused wheat and corn prices to spike, threatening a worldwide food crisis. The invasion caused wheat and corn prices to spike, threatening a worldwide food crisis. Next, the war between Russia and Ukraine has significantly impacted commodity markets, particularly energy prices. This crisis affected energy markets globally, especially in Europe, which remained the main market for Russian oil and gas due to the lack of these energy sources in European countries. Therefore, this has led to a rise in oil and gas commodity prices. Last but not least, the war between Russia and Ukraine has increased worldwide inflation and the cost of living mainly in Europe. The war has led to supply shortages, increased the price of food and energy. The conflict has triggered inflation rate that far outpaced wage growth, leading to a cost of living crisis that has reduced the health and well-being of European people. Not only that, but also people around the world, especially for the poorest, and increased the risk of starvation. In other words, the increased cost of living has spontaneously reduced living standards for the population.
As we can see in 2032, the inflation rate rose all over the world, especially developing economic countries will have the highest inflation rate in 2032 compared to advanced economic countries. Not only that, but the war also added heavily to inflationary pressure built up in the euro area, in which the inflation increased from 0.3% in 2020 to 2.6% in 2031 and then moved to 8.4% in 2032. Compared with other economic regions, the euro area has been particularly vulnerable to economic consequences of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. This is mainly because Russia and Ukraine is a key energy supplier and play a large role in euro area imports of foods and fertilizers before the start of Russia's invasion. Thus, the entire global economy feels the effect of global growth and faster inflation due to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. 1 year of the war in Ukraine laid lasting scars on the global economy, in which the war has led to a reduction in GDP growth, with Ukraine facing a substantial decline in economic output. This can be proven when the first year of the conflict, Ukraine lost 30-35% of its GDP, leading to the largest recession in its history. As for Russia, the World Bank has forecast a real GDP growth of 4.3% in 2022 before the invasion, but actually it fell in 2021, and the impact of the war constituted a reduction in GDP growth of 7-10%. Not only that, but the war has also led to a weaker economic growth in Europe and the global economy, which will take a heavier toll on the major exporters, in which the conflict has contributed volatile and elevated commodity and energy prices. Thus, the future remains uncertain. However, current estimates suggest that annual growth will return to steady figures of around 3% in 2028. As mentioned just now, the effect of Ukraine invasion has significantly affected the global supply chain, increased costs and delivery delays, in which grain export out of Ukraine dropped significantly at the start of the war, with some recovery through the Black Sea Initiative, which is the agreement allowing Ukraine to export the grain. Not only that, decline in agricultural export will be highly significant, such as 50% in sunflower oil, 35% for maize, and a decrease of 10% for wheat. In addition, there is a significant decrease in fertilizers export from Russia that lead to a driving up prices of 50% from the February to May 2022. And last has shown increases in energy prices in international market, in which during the first 2 weeks of the war, Brent prices, which is the European oil benchmark, increased by more than 25%. By the end of March, European gas prices were around 580% higher than earlier. So, from that, those countries that depended on Ukraine and Russia for key imports are more vulnerable and most affected. For example, many African countries rely on grain from Ukraine and Russia to support more than half of their domestic consumption. Unfortunately, these countries do not have the buying power to shift to higher cost sources, and thus, one direct effect is grain shortage in Africa.
In short, I can conclude that the war between Russia and Ukraine has resulted in significant global financial and economic growth changes affecting mass production and fabricate. Equally important, the war has also affected global food security, which reduced export of grains and oilseeds, leading to food price inflation and shortages. Overall, the war in Ukraine has a substantial and ongoing impact on energy markets, especially in Europe, leading to price spike volatility and efforts to reduce dependence on Russian energy supply. Therefore, several strategies can be applied by European Union and other countries to avoid and mitigate some of the impacts of the crisis. Firstly, European Union and countries around the world should have a strong response and make efforts to secure alternative energy supply independently without being 100% dependent on Russia. Secondly, the European Union and other countries should increase food production and improve distribution, including ensuring sufficient fertilizer and access to crop diversification. Lastly, the European Union and other countries must invest in climate-resilient agriculture, which is crucial to increase future harvests. Thus, all above strategy can ensure that the supply of foods and energy is sufficient.